Paul Thornton. Welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for inviting me.
You're more than welcome. The pleasure is mine. I'm excited to dive into our topic of conversation today. But before we do, can you give the listeners a quick bit of context about who you are and what it is that you do?
I live in Massachusetts in the USA. I spend a lot of time studying and observing leaders. It's really been a major part of my career. I write books and articles. I do some conferences speaking at them. I do some coaching, and I spend a lot of time watching my grandsons play various sports: hockey, lacrosse, soccer, you name it. So that's kind of what I'm doing now.
I like it. Very diverse. And it sounds like, as you mentioned, there's been a lot of focus on leadership in your life. What has allowed you to grow so fascinated with the concept of leadership?
Well, it's funny. I played hockey in high school, and the team that I was on, we were always kind of in third or fourth place out of like nine teams in the league. And there were always one or two teams that were always one or two. They were the best teams every year, you know? And it got me thinking, why is that? Why isn't my team number one or number two? Why aren't we winning the championships? And I concluded that it had something to do with the coach. The coach was doing something different. They were leading, they were setting high standards, they were giving more precise feedback. I didn't know exactly what they were doing, but I had a thought that they were doing something different. So that kind of got me interested in this whole idea of coaching and leading and helping people be the best that they can be. From there, I went to college and I had a great instructor who was big into leadership, and he taught me a great deal, and that further stimulated my interest. So that got me going, and the more I got into it, the more excited I got, and the more I learned about it, the more I realized, boy, this is a complex subject, and leadership, there's a lot to it. And just when I thought I had it figured out, something else would come along and they'd say, no, that's not correct, or I'd have to rethink what I was thinking, and I kept working at it. So I've spent a lifetime focused on that topic, leadership.
Absolutely. And do you personally consider yourself a leader, Paul?
Well, that's a good question. I like to think I'm a leader. I think I'm more of a thought leader. Thought leaders, I think, put out ideas and concepts. There's a variety of types of leaders. There have been times in my life when I've had to stand up and say something or do something that was challenging. That certainly takes a leader to do that. There's the servant leader. The servant leader really is focused on helping people achieve their goals, giving them the support and guidance and resources they need. So there's different types of leaders. I think we all probably enter the role of leader in various situations. We don't always stay in that role, we move on to other things, but I think we all play that role on occasion, and when we do, it's very important and very significant.
And do you think we should all aspire to be leaders in certain areas of our lives? Or do you think,
I
yeah, you
agree.
do believe that we all should aspire
I
that?
do. Yeah, I think, yeah, I do. I think there's opportunities for all of us to add value and make a difference as a leader. And if we have the courage and confidence to step up and do something or say something or give feedback to someone, or whatever it might be, we are helping that person or that team or that organization perform at a higher level.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to zoom out a little bit and I want to get your definition of leadership. I know you also speak about four different processes when it comes to leadership as well. Can you share your definition and go through those processes so we get a really good concrete idea of what you mean when you speak about leadership?
For me, a leader is someone who influences and inspires people to make positive changes. The leader wants to improve the status quo. They want to help people perform at a higher level. So they do various things to make that happen. Contrast that to a manager is someone who uses current methods and procedures to get the work done. We need managers. There's nothing wrong with being a manager, but we need to have a combination of managers and leaders. Stability is what managers like and want, and that's good. Stability is a good thing, but we also need to change. The world keeps changing. Our customers' needs and wants keep changing. So we need to find the right balance between stability and change, or managing and leading. But for me, yeah, the leader is the person who is inspiring people, motivating people, encouraging them to do something different, to add more value, to be more productive, to make a bigger impact in whatever it is they're doing. So that's kind of my definition of leadership. What do you think? What's your view of leadership? How would you define it?
Yeah, I liked your perspective on it in the sense that they are the ones who lead by example and they inspire. I really think of it when it comes to sports teams. That's something that kind of brings to my mind when I think about leaders. And it's not necessarily always the person who's potentially the loudest. It's not always the person who is, shouting the instructions or even just delivering X, Y, or Z play that someone needs to then follow through on. It's the person who's, like you mentioned, inspiring the team to move forward. It's promoting that mindset and that culture of progress. And I really like that concept of not necessarily looking like the person, who's speaking the loudest, but it's kind of their actions are speaking the loudest. And they don't really need to say an enormous amount. They just need to show the team what needs to be done, or show their people, their family. And like you said, there's leadership in every different way. And for them to be able to follow and be very congruent with the mission, and with the collective mission of the team as well. And if you've got someone who's able to inspire people to move in that direction without needing to, as you mentioned, manage them or kind of be too on top of them or even too distant as well, I think that's, for me, what makes a very, very good leader personally.
Yeah, I totally agree. Totally, I think you nailed it.
Yeah, absolutely. So run us through those 4 processes that you speak about as well.
I've studied leaders for a long time, and I've found that 3 things stand out for me, and I'll get to the process in a minute, but all of them have a core set of beliefs and values that they strongly believe in. And they use those core beliefs and values to guide their behavior, their life, the actions they take. Number 2, they all want to improve the status quo. I mentioned that before. And number 3, they more or less follow a process to make that happen. Now, I know there's a lot of different types of leaders, but there's some themes in terms of what they do to make a difference and add value. So I wrote a book on this. It's called The Leadership Process, and I describe 4 steps, as you mentioned, Elliot, that leaders follow. And the first step is diagnose the current situation. And that really is getting a clear understanding of what's currently happening, what's currently going on. And that involves looking at the people, the processes that are being used, the performance, what's working, what isn't working, what's being accomplished. And all leaders need to do that. You got to get a handle on the current environment, the current culture, before you try to improve it. Some of the challenges, though, in doing that is we certainly all have certain blind spots that we affect us, so we don't see reality often as clearly as we need to. So blind spots are a problem. Some leaders surround themselves with yes people. The yes person's always telling them, you're doing a great job, everything's super, keep up the good work. And, the ship is going down slowly but surely. And the other thing is, some leaders have a fear of change. They kind of just want to keep doing what they've been doing. They've been successful. They want to just keep going. So there's certain things that distort our view of reality or make us not get a clear picture of the current situation. So one thing I recommend for all of these steps is you engage and involve other people. So it's really important you talk to customers. How do they see the current situation? employees, suppliers, consultants. Everyone's got a different view or a slightly different view maybe, but get multiple viewpoints to get clarity on what's currently going on, what's happening, what's working, and put all those pieces together and form your own coherent view of what is the current situation. So that's kind of step one. Step two is identify opportunities. How can we improve? What can we do differently? How can we do things better? And sometimes things are very obvious that a certain change is needed. Sometimes brainstorming or networking. Again, getting input from other people. What do they think needs to be done and why, and what would be an improvement? Studying your best competition or studying the best companies. What do they do? All of that helps you see, okay, this is where we are today. This is what some possibilities we have to improve. Now, invariably, you can come up with 10, 15, 20 things you can improve on. And we don't have the resources and the time and energy and people to do all those things. So we got to decide what's the one or two things we're going to pursue. And that's a challenge for some some leaders. I've seen some companies where they're pursuing 12 different things all at once, and it's complete chaos and confusion. Employees are stressed out. They're not sure what the priorities are, and nothing gets accomplished. So I think less is better. What's the one or two things, the major actions you're going to take that will have the biggest impact on the current situation? And of course, you got to do a lot of analysis, cost benefit analysis, and do I have the resources and all that type of stuff. So that's kind of the second step. The third step is presenting your message. Once you decide what it is you want to pursue, what's your big idea to make things better, you have to present that to the appropriate people to convince them. So in presenting your message, you got to do two things. One, you got to explain it, and two, you got to sell people on your idea. Now, explaining it and selling it, you got to think about what examples am I going to use, what stories, what illustrations, what visual aids. You got to think long and hard about that. So it's really important to boil it down to what is your big idea, how much detail do you need to provide, and then present it. And here again, I think it's very important you get other people involved to get their thoughts and ideas in how effectively your presentation comes across. So do some dry runs, try it out, get feedback, tweak it, make changes, fine tune it until you get it down to the precise message you want to convey. Here again, I've seen many leaders present their big idea and they go into so much detail that their big idea is lost. They're confusing and people walk away like, I don't know what we're supposed to do. and again, that's not good. So that's kind of the third step. And then the final step is developing a plan and implementing it. And getting a plan, you got to think about who is the target group, who is the people that need to change to make things better. And you got to be clear on that. And then you got to think about, is that target group able and willing to do what they need to do? And the plan is really all about helping them be more able and be more motivated to do what they need to do. So training, incentives, mentoring programs, it includes a variety of things, but to pursue any change, you need a plan. Small change, big change, you need a plan. So what is the plan? And then secondly, how are you going to implement it? Who's going to do what? That needs to be all laid out and defined and detailed. And if you're involved in a big, major organizational change, you're typically going to charter a team, and that team is going to work together to develop the plan, including how it will be implemented to make it all happen. So that's kind of the 4 steps that I think leaders more or less follow, and each step has certain things the leader needs to do, but there's also some traps and some problem areas that they find themselves in and cause them to be less effective than they could be.
Yeah, I would love to talk about those in just a moment. But a question that comes to my mind is that four-step process seems incredibly effective and probably something that a lot of leaders will maybe do when they come into maybe a company or a team or whatever that might be. But I imagine that if a company is growing, especially if it's growing quickly, that maybe is the type of thing you want to do every 6 months or every year. Is it something that's kind of a repeatable process to go and diagnose the situation again, see how things have changed, then identify the opportunities once again, and present the message for the next year, etc.? Do you have to kind of start from almost scratch? You've obviously got a foundation, but it sounds like that's something that you could continue to do and continue to do. Is that something that you encourage?
I think I encourage people, leaders, to always be doing number one and number two. Diagnosing. The world is changing very quickly these days in some industries and some companies. So diagnosing what's going on, getting feedback, asking questions of employees and customers and colleagues and what have you. That's important to be doing all the time. And number two, to be always thinking about opportunities. What is this company doing and why are they doing it and how's it working out? So those two are really important. I think periodically you got to identify the one big idea you're going to pursue to make things better. And I think that you do less frequently. Maybe every, once a year you have a major program you're going to pursue. And then you need the plan and implementation part of it as well. But like I say, one and two, I think you got to do all the time these days. Three and four, maybe once a year, but less frequently.
Yeah, that makes us.
Does that make sense to
Yeah, it
you?
makes a lot of sense because realistically, if you're presenting a message or maybe presenting like a company or team ethos, realistically, it's kind of like your values to a degree. Those things don't generally change unless, like you mentioned, the market changes enormously or you go in a completely different direction. But generally speaking, that's not going to happen. But I think, like you said, asking questions, looking to constantly innovate as well can be valuable as long as you don't get distracted by a bit of a shiny object syndrome and start heading in different directions that don't serve you or the company. But yeah, I can definitely see that being valuable. So talk to me about some of the common pitfalls and things that make us less effective when trying to follow through on this process.
Well, I think as I said earlier, each step there's a problem or multiple problems that occur. Some leaders get so locked into the strategy they implemented that they're not inclined to change. They're not really open or curious. They just keep doing what they've done for the last 5 years and think everything will be great. So that's a problem. They're not motivated. As I said, some leaders present their ideas. They're not effective in selling them. They're not effective in explaining what's in it for the person. How are they going to benefit from it? So their message gets, convoluted and diluted and not accepted to the extent that it needs to be to get people excited about the change. I mean, change isn't easy. Everybody's got a plate that's overflowing these days. So presenting your message of change in a way that people are going to buy into it and get excited about it is not easy. And a lot of people fall down on that. So you really, as I said, you got to think long and hard and get feedback and take time to fine tune your idea and make sure it's relevant to people and meaningful to people, and they're going to see the value in it and like I say, get excited about it. And if that happens, then you're off to a good start.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because when you think of a CEO of a company, for example, unfortunately, most people's minds go towards someone who's fairly egotistical, someone who makes the calls and, makes these big decisions, doesn't really factor in the perspective of someone who's a little bit lower down in the hierarchy of the company. Whereas you're kind of saying the opposite in the sense of always be asking questions, reflect on other people's experiences, people who are on the ground, etc. So how does a leader essentially take their responsibility and really embrace their role, but without getting lost in their ego? And also, it sounds like a lot of personal development as well, right? You're asking people to challenge what's worked before, to step out of their comfort zones, embrace the fears that they have. That sounds like a lot to balance the ego, to, almost tell them to resign the version of themselves that got them success in the past. So how does a leader go about doing that?
Yeah, that you're right, Elliot. That is exactly what makes it very hard to do. I mean, you put a lot of time and effort into making the company successful. You implemented a great strategy. It worked. It did well. But now change is required because the world has changed. Customers have changed. You got to be open and humble. There's a lot of talk these days that leaders need to be humble. If you're humble, you're more open to feedback, you're more willing to question yourself as well as what you're currently doing, and you're more open to considering other points of view. And I think the leaders that tend to be more progressive and more effective are humble, and they are curious, and they do ask a lot of questions, and I think that's a good thing. And as you get that input, you start to realize that, I do need to make some changes, and we got to do things differently. And if we keep going the way we're going, we're not going to be as competitive as we need to be. So I guess the one word I keep going back to is this idea of being humble, and I like that idea because when you're humble, you're open to feedback. Feedback isn't easy. I used to be a college teacher, and my students would give me feedback. And of course, some gave me great feedback and loved the class and all that, so that was good. But you'd always get that one or two or three people that would give you negative feedback. They didn't like this, they didn't like that, you should have responded quicker. And it's painful to, process that feedback and to consider it fully and think about, what can I learn from it? How can I improve? What's the message they're telling me? And like I say, it's very easy to deny it and say, oh, that's a lot of BS. They don't know what they're talking about. 28 of my 30 students thought I was outstanding. So what do these two people know? Well, the outlier often has the courage to give you that candid feedback that you need to consider. So yeah, I'm making it sound like it's easy to do. It's not, but it's valuable, and you got to do it to improve.
Absolutely. So, what can we do as leaders or aspiring leaders to be able to be confident enough to make these decisions, to step out of our comfort zone, but also take that critical feedback when it comes back, but at the same time be neutral enough to say, okay, I'm going to try and extract what's useful here, but not get too offended by what was hurtful, or stay true to my vision, try and take an element of what's important, but not kind of go completely in the opposite direction, because there might be people who are challenging for your position. So they might have their own ideas of what is best for the company. And sometimes you might have to have that inner confidence and that inner knowing. So what does a leader have to do to look after themselves? We obviously hear a lot about morning routines, going to courses and all these types of things. Do they need to meditate? Do they need to exercise? What does a leader need to do to just foster their best personal growth that they possibly can, both physically and mentally, to show up the best that they can for their team and to ultimately be the best leader they can be?
Yeah, that's a great question, Elliot. You can't go the other extreme. Someone gives you feedback and you immediately make changes. I mean, you could be changing direction every other day. Self-reflection is critical. Spending time thinking about what you did, why you did it, your values, your purpose, working with a mentor, being open to considering what people are telling you. Not that you have to agree with it, but at least considering it. But having some routine where you're going to spend time in self-reflection, or some method you're going to use to get at self-reflection, I think is very important. And it could be through meditation, like you said. I have meditated for years. I think it's a great technique to get centered and to, be in the moment, so to speak. But yeah, you got to have the tools to get clarity, and then you can look at the feedback you're getting in a more objective way, and I think take the pieces that make sense to you and make changes as you see fit. But you make a very valid point that you can't just be the last person that gave you advice is what you go with. No, it doesn't work that way. You got to take in a lot of information, analyze it, evaluate it, decide what makes sense based on your values, your vision, your approach to leading and making a difference. Otherwise, you have no, I don't know, concrete, I don't know, sense of being a leader. You're just changing every day based on the last tidbit of information someone gave you.
Yeah, absolutely. And what you say obviously sounds like some work, and we've shared that quite expressively and openly. And something that comes to my mind is whether it is for everyone to be a leader. And I think you discussed this at the very, very start of the conversation, is that we can be leaders in different types of way. But something that comes to my mind is the Last Dance documentary on Netflix, where they focused on the Chicago Bulls when it was Scottie Pippen and it was Michael Jordan. And, Michael Jordan is the obvious leader in that team. And Scottie Pippen makes a fantastic number two, right? He moves the team forward, but he's not the one that people remember. I mean, I wasn't super aware. I'm not that aware of basketball compared to other sports, but I wasn't so aware of him compared to Michael Jordan, who almost every single person on this earth has heard of. So is it a case of recognizing that some people just are number twos and they're not necessarily like the front and center leader? Or is it a case of saying, well, actually everyone has that opportunity, but I'm sure that maybe you know a little bit more about whether people should take that, or maybe they should stay in a position that's not so heavily focused on leadership of the whole team. Can you break that down a little bit of whether we are all fit to be leaders?
Yeah, that's that's a good question. Also, I think that everyone has the potential to be a leader. A lot of people don't want to be a leader. Keep in mind, leaders need to do some very difficult things, like giving people some tough negative feedback or challenging people to step up and be more of a leader on the team, or step up and perform at a higher level. Leaders have to make very difficult decisions on pulling the plug on a project that's been going on for a year, and all of a sudden the leader decides, no, we're not going to pursue that any longer. We're going to go in this direction. So not everyone wants to be a leader. They have a strong need to be liked. They don't want to make the hard decisions. So, yeah, so those people, I don't know, don't step up or want that role, so they kind of don't take it on. Sometimes, as you said, people have a number two person that is close to them. They give them a lot of direct feedback. They help them, encourage them, and support them. That's a role that we see in many organizations, where the number two person, very important person, but they're supporting the leader. They're not the one ultimately making the tough decision, though. The leader is the one generally that is making that tough decision to do whatever it is they're doing. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I'll tell you one little story. We used to do a management assessment center at the company I was at, and we had people out of the operations group, foremen, or we had machinists rather, going through this assessment center, and they had to decide whether they wanted to become a foreman. And the foreman would be supervising a group of 8, 10, 12 people. And I always was amazed. We had, in every class that we had, or every group that we had going through, we'd have like 8 or 10 people going through as a group. There'd always be one or two that at the end of the session, it was like a 2-day session, they would say, there's no way I ever want to be a foreman. I would hate the job. I don't want to make those decisions. I just want to run my machine. I like what I'm doing, blah, blah, blah. And that was a great awakening for them, that they realized, no, I don't want to be a foreman. And I think the same thing holds true in the leadership realm, that some people just they don't want to be a leader. They want to be on the team, they want to help, they want to support, but they don't want to be the one making the tough decisions, giving the candid feedback, as I say, pulling the plug on projects that have been going on for a couple of years. Making the hard decisions isn't always easy. You're not liked by everybody. Let's face the fact. There's a lot of people that are going to second guess the leader, question the leader, think that they're all wrong, they're not doing the right thing. It's part of the game, a part of the reality.
Yeah, and I think you answered the question very well because you said to us that everyone has the potential to be a leader, but that doesn't mean that everyone should be a leader. And I think it's very similar in the world of entrepreneurship as well. Is that most people have the potential to be an entrepreneur, but that doesn't mean everyone should be. And I think a lot of people are beginning to realize that. And I had a conversation on leadership not so long ago on this podcast as well, and I was speaking to a person who really spends a lot of his time going into different offices and speaking about this stuff. And we were having a conversation about the fact that usually it's the person who's most talented in their given area that then goes into this leadership position, which is unfortunate because they're actually very good at what they do, but when it comes to actually then leading the team, they're not quite as talented. So from a company perspective, you've just gained a leader that's great at what they do from like the fundamentals of why they were there in the first place, but they're not actually that good at leading the team forward. And usually that seems to be the promotion of growth. So what we kind of establish is maybe there needs to be these better routes for people who kind of reach these upper echelons of their companies and their high performers, not necessarily to go into management routes, but to continue doing what they're doing. Maybe they train up other people to get to their level, but they have that ability to progress without actually going into that leadership position, which actually isn't their natural pursuit. They're much better at doing the thing that they are the best at, if you know what I mean.
Yep, company, I couldn't agree more. The company I worked at, we had a lot of engineers and highly technical, skilled people. There were like 20,000 employees at the company, and there were 2,000 engineers. And to make more money initially, you had to go the management leadership route. That's the way you made your salary increased. We concluded that this doesn't make sense. There's too many great designers and technical people that love what they do, but they don't want to manage people. So we developed a two-track system that you could advance salary-wise, technically, in the same way you could advance on the leadership ladder, and that worked out quite well. And as you said, there were a number of people that loved designing and playing with the technology and coming up with new and better, widgets and what have you. And they didn't want to manage people. That was not in their vision. They just didn't want to do that. And
yeah, but
they
the challenge
loved what they
is
did.
that they wanted more money, right? So, and the only
Yeah,
route
they wanted
usually
exactly.
is to go up in management, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what they. The only reason they put their hand up when they said who wants to be a manager was because they wanted to make more money. But when we changed all that, it changed things dramatically and was a good way to go. So I would encourage any high-tech companies to have that dual ladder idea that you can advance salary-wise and have different titles for certain levels of technical expertise as well to recognize their skill set and what have you. And we had some technical people that were mentoring a whole bunch of other people, and their value was, unbelievably important, and we wanted to reward them for that, and they should be making as much money as the director level leader or VP, leader who's running the organization.
Yeah,
And they were
I
in
love
some
that.
cases.
I think that has to be the future if people want high performing talent, because a high performing talent isn't easy to come across. And if you put someone in that managerial position and they're a subpar manager, but they're an incredible, like I said, designer or engineer, it just doesn't make any sense really. But like you said, you've got to reward them, because if otherwise they will go down the route of maybe it's prestige around having that title, but many times it is, a financial thing. And if you keep them in that position that they love, they get the financial reward that they deserve as well, then, I think everyone remains a lot more happier as well. So transitioning back onto the leadership side of things, is there ever such thing as too much leadership? I can imagine there's certainly such thing as too little, but can you tell us a little bit more about the pros and cons of having too much or too little?
Yeah, I just wrote a book about the idea that leaders need to provide the right amount of something. In a general sense, leaders coach, they give feedback, they delegate, they establish rules and regulations, all these things that they do. Sometimes, though, they can do too much of it or too little. So, take the example of coaching. Some coaches provide so much information and so many details that they are less effective. We walk away confused, our head is spinning, we're not sure what we're supposed to do. So too much is bad. On the other extreme, too little. Some coaches, some leaders do little to no coaching. They're absent, they don't think it's their job, they think the employee should be able to do what they need to do, so they don't provide any coaching. So that's bad. So finding that right spot, along the continuum of too much and too little is something that leaders need to do as well. Take the example of delegation. I worked at a company, and I recall one leader who would over delegate to his top performers, the one or two people who consistently delivered great work. The leader would give them more and more and more to do. So their plates became overwhelmed, or they became overwhelmed, and they just couldn't get it all done, and they eventually got burnt out. So too much delegating to your star performers isn't good. On the other hand, this person did little to no delegation to a lot of other people. So those people weren't getting the opportunity to show what they could do, and they weren't getting developed in the same way. So again, where is that fine line? Am I, doing too much or too little? What changes do I need to make to help me be more effective? And I think this applies to a lot of different aspects of leadership. And going back to what we talked about before about reflection, this gets into that again, reflecting on, am I doing too much or too little? What do I need to try? What do I need to do differently? And sometimes it's trial and error. Sometimes it's backing off a little bit and making a change, making a tweak to your approach, seeing how that works, and being open and experiment until you get it right. And it's dynamic because it keeps changing. As the person grows, you may need less coaching down the road, but they may need a little bit of coaching at certain points, and at those certain points you need to provide what is most appropriate and what's needed. So another challenge of leaders is finding out, how much should I be providing? What's too much, what's too little, where do I need to be on this continuum of many options I have?
And would you say there's a more favorable end to be on that continuum if you were just giving it a go to begin with? Let's say you are very new to a company. Would you say potentially less is better or more is better, or do you just really just have to establish where that middle point is?
Well, I don't even think it's always the middle point. I think it's what's appropriate or what's needed to help the person perform and what makes sense. Each case is different. This gets back to what we talked about before, diagnosing the environment, diagnosing the situation. What's going to help this person perform and do their best? Do they need a little bit of coaching or a lot of coaching or no coaching? Just tell them what they need to do and set the goals and tell them have at it. So I think each case is a little bit different. I don't think there's any one precise answer you can give, and I think you got to evaluate the person, the task that they're doing, and then decide how much or how little would be appropriate.
Yeah, certainly. And a big challenge that usually comes along in the process of growth is expanding the team, right? And I think a big thing that happens is that culture is potentially lost. That thing that made the company or the team the thing it truly was. I worked in a company back in, I think it was 2017 or 16. And I know that when they started the business, I think it was probably like 2009, 2010, it was really important that what they built their reputation off was the culture and the ethos of that gym, right? It was a super hardcore gym. You had to know your stuff, you had to get the best possible results. But then they started expanding and opening units all over the world. And obviously, there was only so many people they could take on with that mindset whilst continuing to expand the business. And the culture slowly begun to kind of water its way down. So, how can you maintain that high level of culture, ethos, those values, whilst your team is expanding? Does a little bit have to be sacrificed in the pursuit of growth, or is there any ways to kind of just keep that going?
I think for me, the culture is a outgrowth of the core values that the leadership team believes in and models and supports on a day-to-day basis. And to your point, Elliot, as a company grows very quickly, very fast, those values can get diluted in the sense that leaders have less chance to talk about them and discuss them and model them. And when you have people that are working in distant locations or working at home or this or that, the values sometimes takes a back seat and they're not as visible and as clear as they used to be. One of my students, one of my former students worked at a restaurant, and every night before the restaurant started, the shift supervisor would get the team together. It was like 10 servers and busboys and what have you. But he would get the team together and they would talk about one of the restaurant's values, like customer focus on the customer was one of them, I think. And he'd go around and he'd ask each person on the team, what are you going to do tonight to emphasize that value? What is that going to look like? How are you going to make that real? And they would have a discussion about that value. And this restaurant had such a strong culture and their values were so important. That's kind of the extreme case, but this supervisor was making a point that these values are important, they're real. He talked about them, he modeled them, he held people accountable. All of that leads to a very strong culture. If you don't do any of that, if leaders put the values up on the wall and say this is what we believe in and never talk about it again, then it's a joke. And you and I both know companies where people scratch their head and say that's such a farce and so far from reality, it's silly. But it takes a lot of work to, model them, talk about them, make them real, hold people accountable. We all know, too, companies that the great technical performer who happens to be a bully, who happens to, be difficult to work with, nothing happens to that person. He violates many of the company values, but that doesn't matter because he produces great work and all that. The companies that fire that person, that sends an important message to the workforce that these values are real, they're meaningful, we're going to live by them, we're going to work by them, respect, honesty, caring for each other, whatever they are, whatever you agree those values are, you got to make them real. And I think the leaders at the top companies do, in fact, make that a priority and make it real. A lot don't, but some do.
Yeah, it's good to know it's a possibility. It requires work, just like everything, but it definitely can be done. And regular statements need to be made, regular intentions need to be set and lived out as well. And I like that. And it's just about not losing it within the growth. It's just making sure that that is the thread that's weaved throughout all of the units you open, whatever it might be, but it's always present. So something that you spoke to me about at the very start, as you mentioned, you watch your grandsons play a lot of sport. You also mentioned to me off air that you've been asking them a few questions about leadership themselves. So what are 9 to 16-year-olds talking about leadership?
Well, that's a good question. I'm working on this new book and I'm presenting my ideas on leadership, but I'm also interviewing my grandsons, and their ages go from age 9 to 17. And I'm just asking them some basic questions and getting their input. But they have a pretty good sense of The leader needs to be in control. They need to set direction. They need to tell people what to do. That was kind of a theme I've heard a couple different times. My 17-year-old grandson is very bright. He has some good insights that the leader needs to use different approaches depending on the person. You can't just use one approach with every player on the hockey team. He's on the hockey team. So his idea was the leader needs to kind of, my word, but diagnose the situation and figure out what style or what type of interaction do I need to have with this player versus that player. It's an ongoing process. I've had one interview so far with them. I have another one, incidentally, coming up tonight with my 17-year-old, so I've been preparing a few questions for that. One of them, my 9-year-old, this shocked me. He's on a basketball team, and I said, what is one of the traits that all leaders need to have? And his word was positivity. And I hadn't heard that word, but positivity, that the leader needs to be positive, they need to be encouraging, they need to be upbeat. And again, from a 9-year-old, it was pretty impressive to hear what he had to say. So I haven't had any major breakthroughs so far, but we'll see what happens over the next few weeks.
Yeah, that interview tonight is going to be an
Yeah,
interesting one. But it's
it is.
interesting because I was going to say, like, it's almost as if we take your generation, my generation, and your grandson's generation, it doesn't seem like there's an enormous difference between our fundamental beliefs around leadership. So it shows that generation to generation, it's like the fundamentals and the core principles kind of are remaining same. Maybe there's a little bit of nuance here and there, but it doesn't seem to be too far off from what you believe leadership to be, what I believe it to be, what your grandsons believe it to be. It's quite interesting, right?
Yeah. I agree with you. The only thing I haven't heard too much yet is that the leader needs to delegate or empower, or they're much more into the leader's the one in charge, and the leader is directing the team or group what to do and how to do it, that type of thing. But I do agree with you that many of their comments are not that far off from kind of the way I'd look at it, or maybe the way you'd look at it. So the big idea of a leader, some of the themes continue on, and I don't think I'm going to find too many things that are majorly different from what you or I might say about leadership. So, but it's interesting.
Yeah, I was going to say it's a positive because of usually with new information and continuing with the progression of the world and our access to information, new ideas, etc., it usually brings a little more confusion and a little less clarity because there's more factors to consider. But it's nice to see something standing the test of time and saying, well, if these principles are holding up, then we can be pretty confident that they are the principles to follow. So I think, in a world of information, it's nice to have some clarity from time to time, that's for sure.
I was just telling you one quick story. I was very proud of one of my grandsons. He was telling me that one of his classmates was bullying another classmate. And he, on his own initiative, went up and said to the bullier, what you're doing is not right. You need to go and apologize to that student. And he confronted this person. Now, what we were saying before, there's many classmates that didn't have the courage to do what he did. And I was so proud that he, in fact, did that. And the bullier concluded that what he was doing was wrong and he shouldn't have been doing it. And he did go and apologize to the other student. So I said, boy, that shows a lot of great leadership. I'm so proud of you, and keep up the good work, so to speak. So that was a nice little part of one interview I did.
Very nice. Yeah, very,
Yeah.
very good example. And
Yeah. And he's 12 years old, 12 years old
exactly
doing that.
one that's
You know?
inspiring to make at such a young age where the stakes are very high as well, right? Like in his world, the stakes are incredibly high and it could go many different ways. So it's incredibly positive that it went that way. Paul, this has been a fantastic conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And I want to wrap up with a final couple of questions. The first is, what impact would you like to have on the world with the work that you do?
Well, one, I agree with you. I think that thing I have tried to do throughout my career, I have tried to simplify the concept of leadership and what leaders need to do and how to do it. And I've written a bunch of books, and each one is very short and easy to read. They're all available on Amazon. So if you're looking for a short, quick read on leadership styles, leadership process, a bunch of other aspects of leadership, check out my books on Amazon and try one out. I hope you'll like it. But that's been my big mission, I guess, is to simplify and teach and explain some concepts and ideas that will help people be more effective leaders and make a bigger difference in their role, in their family, in their work environment, if they're coaching a team, if they're teaching a course, they're a teacher and teaching a group of students, that type of thing. So yeah, that's what I've tried to do, and I'm still working at it. I speak at conferences and I do a little bit of training. I was in Dubai about a year ago doing a training program over there. So, yeah, that's kind of what I do.
Incredible. I think that you are living out that mission very, very strongly, and I'm sure you will for many more years to come as well. So the listeners can check out the books. Is there anywhere else they can keep up with the work that you're doing?
I post a lot of things on LinkedIn. I try to post on there every day or every other day some input or some idea I have on leadership. So if they want to get another view of what leadership is all about, they can check that out.
Incredible. Paul, thank you so much for your time today. The conversation has been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me, Elliot. I enjoyed it as well.